This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past. And by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags. But I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on three sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean, with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot. But I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sounds of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird look when I told her where I was staying. On the walk back, I passed a small dock tucked into a cave maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that peace didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted, or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge, no matter what I tried. I tested every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but still, no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time, there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by. They were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stop directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try to be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified with fear. That person clicked off the light and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolt would hold. And it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The banging activated something in my brain, though. The threat was real, and even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen, but instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched there for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, and I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was inside. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the waterline. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage. And on that specific night, they knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place, and he swore up and down that he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past, I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say, I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is this. How did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I booked and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to those questions. And the worst part is, I still work the same job. I still live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then. But I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time, I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to. A research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are strictly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers, basically waiving my right to damages if I injured myself or worse. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named Tishi. He didn't talk much. I didn't mind because I was so excited about the excursion. The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears, it looks deceptively small, almost insignificant. But as you get closer, the scale hits you. The seawall wrapping around the island. The apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It was something else entirely. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually standing there. The place felt like a true wonder. Tishi gave me a briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list, but there were strict rules. Stay on designated paths. Don't enter anything marked with red tape. Don't remove anything. Don't touch anything you don't need to. And stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and bulky reinforced work pants that made walking awkward. Despite all the gear, the first couple of hours were amazing. I was taking photos, making notes, completely in my element. Tishi followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. Around midday, we entered one of the large residential blocks. The stairs were intact, barely. You could see daylight through the cracks in the landings. Tishi stayed on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was strange given his earlier stay-in-sight rule. But I didn't argue. Honestly, it was kind of nice not having him hovering over me. I reached the 4th floor and was examining a section of wall where the concrete had separated from the rebar when I noticed something off. The dust patterns. There was dust everywhere. Decades of it. But there was also a path, like someone had been walking there regularly. Not recently, maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eyes, and it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell Tishi. That would have been the smart thing. But I was curious, and I knew he'd probably just shut it down. So I went anyway. I walked carefully down the corridor and pushed the door open. Immediately, I noticed two things. The first was the smell. It was wrong. Not something natural, but not something I could identify as human either. I know that sounds strange, but I had never smelled anything like it before. The second thing was the wall. When I touched it, it was warm, noticeably warmer than any other surface on the island. I stood there for about 30 seconds trying to make sense of it. Maybe the sun. That was my first thought, even though there were no gaps in the ceiling. And maybe the smell came from animals, even though I wasn't aware of any animals living on the island. I went back down and told Tishi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seem curious. He just said it was impossible, that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to show him the room. When I insisted, he refused, flat out. It was unsettling. We continued the tour, but I started paying much closer attention, and I kept noticing things. Nothing obvious, no clothes, no trash, but signs, marks, disturbances. Something had been there. I say something because I couldn't tell if it was human or animal. That was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned it again. This time, Tishi didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was talking to. It was the first time he had used the radio all day. When I asked, he said he was checking the schedule. I didn't believe him, but what could I do? We kept going. We reached a taller residential building near the center of the island. Tishi hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking, then followed me in. That was new. Earlier, he seemed bored. Now, he was alert. The stairwell was narrow but stable. We climbed about 5 floors. This time, he stayed right behind me. Then I entered one of the corner rooms, and that's when I saw it. Against the wall, a pile of blankets and empty water bottles. There was no doubt anymore. Someone was living there. I turned to show Tishi, but when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. Just gone. And that's when the fear hit me. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like Tishi disappearing unlocked something in my brain. Only then was I able to process how bad the situation really was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very intense urge to strip off my gear and scratch my skin. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to panic. I made my way quickly back toward the stairwell we had used, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip immediately. But when I turned the corner, the stairs were blocked. A pile of rubble had collapsed across the landing. There was no way through. I didn't stop to think about whether it had fallen, naturally, or if someone had placed it there. I just ran. I turned and sprinted down the corridor, past the room I had just come from, praying there was another way out. I didn't care about safety anymore. I didn't care about the structure. I just needed to get out. As I was running, I heard movement behind me, footsteps, coming from somewhere down the hallway. I didn't turn around. There was no way I was turning around. I just kept running. The problem was, the building was like a maze. I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know where I was going. It felt like I was looping through the same corridors over and over again. And the whole time, I could hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might be Tishi, but then I realized there was more than one set, multiple people. I was being followed. I finally found another stairwell. I didn't even walk down it. I practically jumped. I don't remember everything after that clearly. Just flashes, daylight, open ground, running. Then the dock. Tishi was standing there. Just standing there. Like nothing had happened. The moment I saw how calm he was, something in me snapped. I went from terrified to furious. I started yelling at him. I told him everything. About the room, about the people, about him disappearing. I even accused him of blocking the stairs. He didn't react, not even a little. It was like he wasn't even listening. I wanted to grab him, shake him, force him to respond, but I couldn't. He was my only way off that island. He had all the control. I had none. The way he stood there, completely unfazed, only made it worse. At one point, I actually found myself hoping that whoever had been in that building would show up, just so he would be forced to admit something was wrong. Eventually, I stopped yelling, not because I felt better, but because it was pointless. After I calmed down, he finally spoke, not about anything I had said, not about what I had seen. He just said, "We are leaving." That was it. No explanation. Nothing. We got on the boat. The ride back felt longer than it should have. I didn't feel safe, not even with him. I kept thinking about what had happened, about the footsteps, about the blocked stairs, about the fact that he knew something, or worse, that he had something to do with it. But we made it back to the mainland, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I did was try to report what I had seen, that there were people on Hashima Island, that someone was living there, that something was wrong. The only person I could think to contact was Dr. Yamamoto, the one who arranged everything, but I couldn't reach him. No response, no replies, nothing. 2 weeks passed. By then, I was back in the United States. Still nothing. It was like he had disappeared. I tried reporting it to the authorities, but nothing came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. Years have passed since then, and I still think about it. But strangely, what bothers me the most isn't what happened on the island. It's what happened after. The silence. The disappearance of Dr. Yamamoto. The fact that no one followed up. No investigation. Nothing. The thing I regret the most is not pushing harder, not digging deeper. If I had spoken Japanese, if I hadn't had to leave so quickly, maybe I could have found answers. But I didn't. And now, I probably never will. This happened over 10 years ago. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces. Places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River. Technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades. As far as I know, it's still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in a long time, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past, it became off-limits to the public. Unless something has changed, you still need a permit just to set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded now, considering how seriously the US takes security these days. That's all you really need to know about it. But for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going. That would have been illegal. But I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably frustrated at how long the thesis was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, even though neither of them were history majors. So I told them some of the interesting details about the places I was researching. The moment they realized that one of the places was literally in the same city we were sitting in, they got hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploration vibe back then. It was pretty popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip. And I'll admit, after all the research I'd done, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunting way or anything. More like, if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Fort Totten Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time. The best kind of fun. Getting the kayaks into the water was surprisingly easy. I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park would be at that time of night. But once we started paddling toward the island, reality began to sink in. There was nothing stopping us anymore. All we had to do was keep paddling. And that's when a bit of nervousness started creeping in. But we kept going. And eventually, we made it. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because of all the overgrowth. We had to push through tall reeds and weeds just to find a stable spot. Once we were on solid ground, the 3 of us just stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough to make out the general shapes of everything. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I know that sounds cliché, but you have to understand, we were still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away. And yet, it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't a small place, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we moved deeper, we passed building after building, most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were structures anymore. At one point, Jesse stopped and stared at a building that had a tree literally growing through it, splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, and he wasn't wrong. That's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about how nature had reclaimed everything. Like the island was swallowing any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I would have assumed the place had been abandoned for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse agreed. I told them no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there. People had died there. But they pointed out that there was already graffiti everywhere, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wouldn't matter. I didn't have the energy to keep arguing. so I told them I wasn't going to stop them. But I wasn't going to watch either. In hindsight, walking off alone was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms, trying to take mental notes for my thesis. But the farther I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You feel safer, but when you're alone, it's completely different. I was walking down a long hallway when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead. It made me jump. Even though I knew it was him, I was still freaked out. I started walking toward it, but something felt off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. Not impossible, but it would mean he left Jansen immediately and rushed ahead. That didn't make sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly where the voice came from, so I called out, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately, from a room just a few doors down. It was Jesse's voice. He said, "In here." I walked toward the room. The doorway was darker than the already dark hallway, and I couldn't see inside. I figured they were messing with me, trying to scare me. That's exactly the kind of thing Jansen would find funny. I stepped inside, and when I shined my flashlight across the room, I saw a figure standing in the far corner, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever it was, they were tall, really tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't fully explain how terrifying that moment was. I screamed. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I turned and ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run, as loud as I possibly could. I have never been more scared in my life. It felt like whatever had been in that room was going to come after me, or that something else would jump out from one of the countless pitch-black rooms I was sprinting past. I finally found them near where we had originally split up. The moment they saw me running toward them like that, they didn't even ask questions. They just started running too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. At first, they didn't believe me, which, honestly, I understood. If Johnson had told me the same story, I probably would have thought he was messing with me. But I kept insisting. I told them I wasn't joking, that I wasn't making it up. And after a minute or so, they started to look scared too. We all agreed on one thing. We needed to leave. Immediately. Whatever we had come to see, it wasn't worth staying. But just as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, we heard it. All three of us, at the exact same time. A sound, faint but clear. A moaning noise, coming from somewhere behind us. From the darkness, it sounded like a woman, an older woman, like she was crying, or in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that once you focused on it, you couldn't ignore it. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jansen and Jesse were panicking. And honestly, so was I. My hands were shaking as we shoved the kayaks into the water. We didn't look back. Not once. The paddle back felt like it took forever. But eventually, we made it. The entire drive afterward, none of us could stop talking about what had happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, trying to find some kind of logical explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that disturbed me the most, was the voice. Because that was Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice, as well as I know my own, and whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him, perfectly, except Jesse was never there. He was with Jansen the entire time. I've thought about going back over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't get within 100 yards of that island without being stopped. I don't believe in the paranormal. I never have, but I still can't explain what happened that night. Someone was on that island with us. Someone who knew my name. Someone who could mimic a voice perfectly. And I don't think I'll ever get an answer. I'll choose to be anonymous with this because it's pretty embarrassing. And also, putting my name out there tied to this is likely a horrible idea. There was a Craigslist ad posted in 2017 by a guy named Jackson. He was advertising free lodging for a girl who would watch over his house and clean. Basically, an au pair or nanny without having to watch any kids. I'll just be honest, I kind of lost the will to do a lot when I was 21. I had zero relationship with my parents or sister, and I only had a handful of friends who I could trust. I dropped out of college my first year, which was part of the reason my parents hated me for a while, and I was working a dead-end job at a vape shop. I like to refer to this period as my attitude era. And when I saw Jackson's Craigslist ad, it really caught my attention. It had like 10 pictures of his house. It looked like a modest middle-class house. Slightly old-fashioned, honestly. But I was into that. The pictures weren't what got my attention the most, though. It was the fact that free living was offered for a nanny-type position. No background check required. I didn't even ask my family or friends their opinion on this post before. I just decided to reply to it. Like I said, I wasn't exactly talking to my parents or sister at the time. Anyway, I texted the number on the ad, and this Jackson guy responded within a few minutes. I expressed interest in the listing and asked some basic questions. He had an answer to everything that honestly made me feel more interested. But he asked pretty early on in the conversation what my gender was. When I said female, it almost seemed as though his responses got longer. I honestly didn't care. Most people tend to prefer having a female housekeeper or nanny. Anyway, I was still interested. Anything that got me out of my parents' house. He said he wouldn't be home most of the time during the day, but he wanted to come home to a clean house, and that he also wouldn't mind coming home to a cooked meal from time to time after work. Honestly, I was cool with that too. If it meant free housing, hell yeah, I'd cook some food. It beat standing in the wage cage at the vape shop. Plus, he also said he'd pay for the groceries. It was sounding almost too good to be true. He suggested I come by later that day to check the place out and see if it was a fit. I said okay. A few hours later, I was on my way in my crappy little Civic to the guy's house. It was in a perfectly normal side of town. The block actually seemed pretty calm and peaceful. The neighboring houses had flowers and decorations outside, suggesting the neighbors were normal too. Good start so far. I went to ring the bell, and when the door opened, I was greeted by a man larger and honestly older than I had pictured. I had imagined a regular 45-year-old dad-looking guy. Instead, it was a man maybe 60 years old, 6 feet tall, gray beard, and a little overweight. He greeted me with a smile and went in for a hug, even though we had just met. And honestly, the amount that he laughed made me feel pretty at ease. He showed me around the house. It was a 2-story house. The first floor was your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup. Then the upstairs had 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. He only showed me the guest room that I'd be using and the bathroom upstairs though. The other doors stayed closed. He said if I ever needed to use the office across the hall, I was welcome to. Down the hall was his room, and another room that he didn't explain. I was surprised to hear there was only one bathroom. Then there was the basement. He said it was unfinished and that he didn't use it for anything other than working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. He didn't show me the backyard that day. I told him I wanted the job, and he told me I was hired. 2 days later, I came back with my stuff. I told my parents I got an apartment when they asked where I was going. I didn't explain anything more. The first night there was when I noticed the cameras. No, they weren't hidden. At least, I don't think they were supposed to be. They were just small, black cameras mounted in the corners of the living room and the kitchen. It made perfectly normal sense to me. He was letting basically a stranger live in his house. It wasn't that crazy that he'd want some security. Still, I wish he had mentioned it. That was the first time I felt even slightly weird about the situation. If you can't tell, I really wanted this to work out. That night, when I went to bed, I noticed how much noisier the house felt than when we toured it. I could hear the wood floors creaking every once in a while. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. I checked my phone, and it was around 1:30 in the morning. Again, I came up with a reason for this in my head. When you're lying in silence trying to sleep, you pick up on more sounds than you would when you're occupied during the day. Plus, every old house makes sounds like that. The next morning, he was already gone like he said he would be. He had left a note on the counter with a list of things he wanted done. It was normal stuff. He wanted me to do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen, and things like that. I tried to just focus on the fact that I wasn't standing behind a vape counter all day anymore. I did his laundry first, then I cleaned the floors and wiped everything down. After that, I went back upstairs and started setting up the bedroom more like my own space. I unpacked my clothes, set up my laptop on a small desk, and put a few personal things around just to make it feel less temporary. I remember thinking, maybe this could actually work out. I was actually being positive. After I finished everything, I just relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on my laptop, not hearing my parents yelling downstairs or having one of them burst through my bedroom door barking orders at me was a breath of fresh air. The first week actually went pretty normal. At night, when he got home, we would talk a little. Just basic stuff. It never really got deep. He asked about where I grew up, what I wanted to do eventually, stuff like that. I cooked dinner a few nights in a row, and he seemed to appreciate it. I started thinking maybe I just overreacted about the cameras and the weird feeling. But it didn't all stay happy and peaceful. One night I made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. I tried my best, but I'm not some housewife-type star chef. I was just some young, angsty goth girl. When he got home, he looked tired and irritated. He took one bite, and his whole face changed. He said it tasted bland. I said sorry and offered to add some seasoning or make something else, but he just snapped. He said something like, "If you're going to be living here for free, the least you could do is learn how to cook something edible." He pushed the plate away and stood up. Then he told me to clean up the mess I made in his kitchen before walking away toward his bedroom. That caught me completely off guard. It wasn't even just what he said. It was how fast his personality seemed to change. He had seemed so easygoing before that. I cleaned everything up quietly and hoped he had just had a bad day and nothing more. Everyone has bad days. The next morning I actually apologized to him. I didn't even really think I did anything wrong, but I wanted to keep things smooth. I told him I was sorry about dinner and that I'd try harder. He just laughed like it was nothing. Then he said something that made everything weird. He said maybe I could make it up to him by cleaning the house in my underwear that day. He said it with a smile, like it was supposed to be funny. I remember just kind of freezing for a second because I didn't know how to respond. I told him I wasn't comfortable with that, to put it lightly. He just laughed again and said he was joking, told me to relax, and then went to bed. I remember standing there after he left, feeling really unsettled. It was the first time. I really thought maybe there was something off about him beyond just being moody. That was the first time I texted one of my close friends about what was going on. I told her about the living situation and what he said. She immediately told me I was insane for staying there. She told me to leave as soon as possible. I didn't want to, though. As weird as it was getting, I still felt like I had more control over my life there than I did living with my parents. Going back there felt like failing again. The next Monday, I was leaving the house to go buy groceries with some money he had left for me. As I was driving, a car behind me started laying on the horn. I thought I did something wrong while driving, but it kept following me. I pulled over because I started getting scared that something was really wrong. The car pulled up behind me, and a girl got out. She looked around my age. She walked up to my window and asked if I was living at that house. When I said yes, she immediately told me I needed to stay away from that man. Apparently, Jackson wasn't even his real name. She said she was the girl who had the same arrangement before me. She told me she eventually realized he had cameras watching her constantly. She said she started noticing he knew things he shouldn't know. She said when she tried to leave, he made it very difficult and kept asking questions about where she was going and when she was coming back. Then she told me one night she woke up and saw him leaving her bedroom. That part made me physically sick. Then she told me the worst part. She said he didn't even have a job. She said he lied about going to work every day. And she eventually realized he was still somewhere inside the house most days. I just sat there trying to process it. Every little weird thing suddenly started making sense. I asked her how I could leave without causing problems. She told me to act completely normal and to start slowly taking important things out so he wouldn't notice. She said when I left, I should make it look like I was just running errands. She told me not to confront him and not to let him know I knew anything. After she left, I just sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going back. When I walked back into the house, it felt completely different. I felt like I was being watched even more than before. That night, I checked the room carefully like she suggested. She was right. After a few minutes of looking around, I noticed something small on the top shelf of the closet. It was pushed away into the corner. When I moved a box, I saw a tiny black lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole. I just slowly put the box back like I didn't see it. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay there in the darkness, staring around the room, wondering what I had gotten myself into. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't fall asleep that night, because at some random hour in the night, I heard my door creak open. I flipped onto my side and looked at the door. It was Jackson. He noticed me looking at him, apologized for waking me, and closed the door. What the hell was that weirdo planning on doing? I needed to get out of there. The next morning I started my plan. Every day I would bring one small bag of stuff to my car. Just normal things, nothing obvious. 3 days later, I left while he was at work, and I never came back. Though, if what that girl told me was true, who knows where he actually was? Maybe somewhere inside the house. He texted me later asking where I was. I told him I decided to move back home and thanked him for the opportunity. He kept texting, asking why, and saying I should at least come talk to him in person. I never responded again. About a week later, I noticed something that still bothers me. I got an email notification saying someone had tried to log into one of my old accounts. The login attempt was from the same town his house was in. I changed everything after that. I don't know what his real intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. Nothing technically happened to me, but I really believe that if I had stayed longer, something eventually would have. If you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember, nothing like that is ever really free. I hired her sometime around the beginning of last fall. I work long hours and live alone in a 2-floor house I bought a couple of years ago. It's pretty small, yet still more space than I really need. And I started realizing I was falling behind on keeping it clean. Maybe I needed a girlfriend to keep the place clean at the time. No matter how much I told myself I'd get to cleaning the house, I never seemed to be able to. One night after work, I was just scrolling Craigslist and other similar sites and saw a listing for house cleaning. It was just a simple post saying independent cleaner, cash only, flexible schedule. I figured, why not? Maybe this was what I needed. I emailed, and she responded the next morning. She said she usually did apartments, but was fine doing houses too. We agreed on a day she could come by while I was at work. She asked a few normal questions like how big the house was and if there were pets. I told her no pets, a relatively small house, and that I lived alone. Looking back, I wish I hadn't mentioned that last part so casually. She came the following Thursday. I met her quickly before leaving for work. And yes, before you ask, I hid anything of value in my lockable closet before leaving. She looked to be maybe 38. She seemed very quiet. She didn't really make eye contact much, but I just figured she was shy. I showed her around quickly, all the rooms. I wanted her to clean upstairs and downstairs. I told her she didn't need to worry about my office room. She asked where I usually kept the cleaning supplies, and I showed her the laundry room. She asked if she could come regularly every couple of weeks. I said maybe. I wanted to see how this first time went. Before I left, she asked what time I usually got home from work. I told her around 6, or sometimes closer to 7 depending on traffic. At the time, that didn't seem weird since she probably just didn't want to still be there when I got back. When I got home that night, the place honestly looked great. The floors and counters were shiny, and everything smelled like cleaning products. I paid her what we agreed, and she left. Nothing seemed wrong. For about a week, everything was good. Then it started, maybe 6 nights later. I woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'm not a great sleeper, so this wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I thought I heard a soft thump from downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling, or one of those random house noises you hear at night. Put simply, I ignored it, as most people do when they hear these sounds. A couple of nights later, I woke up again, and this time I heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing. Again, I just assumed I was half asleep and imagining things. I didn't go check. I definitely wasn't going to walk around a dark house at 3 in the morning over something that was probably nothing. I wish I did. Over the next week, I started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not enough to really alarm me. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open a few inches. I figured maybe I left it that way. Another time, a chair at my dining room table seemed pulled out slightly. Again, I assumed I must have done it without thinking. One Saturday morning, I noticed the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp. Stuff like that kept happening. small. Things that you could always explain away if you wanted to. Then the nighttime sounds kept happening. Always soft enough to ignore. Once it sounded like a single slow footstep, but I convinced myself it was probably the wood floors adjusting. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut instead of cracked open, like I usually did. I didn't really want to admit I was getting uneasy, but I was. One night I woke up and was almost sure I heard movement right outside my bedroom, like pressure shifting on the floor. I still didn't get up. I just stared at my door, waiting to see if the handle would move. Yes, I was starting to get that paranoid, but nothing happened, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning I felt stupid for even being scared. I checked the house, and everything looked normal. Around this time, I texted the cleaner again about coming back. Overall, she did a good job, and I figured maybe I was just stressed from work. She came again another weekday while I was at work. Same routine. I left the back door unlocked for her. When I got home, everything looked clean again. She asked if I wanted to schedule something regular. I told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed like a waste of money to me. About a week after that second cleaning, I started noticing food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should. Like I lost my mind one night, swearing to myself that there was at least one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, and now it was gone. Bread slices seemed lower than I remembered too. I was still trying to explain these things away, but one morning, I found a glass in the sink that I was almost positive I hadn't used. I lived alone and was single at the time, so there really wasn't anyone else it could have been. At one point, I wondered if maybe I was doing these things half asleep and not remembering. I even Googled stuff about sleepwalking. Things really changed one night when I woke up and clearly heard slow footsteps downstairs. I know what footsteps sound like compared to house-settling noises. These were steps. I grabbed my phone and stopped to listen. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard what sounded like something lightly bump into a wall. I didn't go downstairs. I know some people might think that sounds stupid, but fear really does make you freeze sometimes instead of act. Or maybe I was choosing flight over fight before even confronting the situation. I just stayed in bed, sitting up for half an hour, not hearing anything again, and finally convincing myself it was nothing. Looking back, I see myself as a coward for that. Morning came, and that day I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I even checked my basement, even though I never heard anything from there. Clear. A few days later, I noticed something that really bothered me. In my kitchen junk drawer, where I keep random things like batteries and takeout menus, I also kept 2 spare house keys on a small ring. One of them was gone. I got goosebumps when I considered the obvious possibility, but I kept telling myself, no, it's not possible. I searched the whole house, but I couldn't find it. The cleaner had been alone in the house twice for several hours each time. I started locking my bedroom door at night after that. About 4 nights later, I decided to test something. I left for work like normal, but after driving a few blocks, I circled back and parked on the next street over. I walked back quietly and went in through my back door. I stayed upstairs and just waited. Around 11:00 in the morning, I heard something. The sound of my front door unlocking. I heard very soft footsteps come inside. I moved to where I could see part of the downstairs through the stair railing. It looked like her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived there. She didn't even have cleaning supplies. She went into my kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a drink and sat at my table. She sat there quietly for a few minutes. Then she walked slowly around my living room. Looking at things, she picked up a framed photo of me and my brother and just stared at it. Then she walked toward the stairs. I backed up as quietly as I could into my bedroom and shut the door without making any noise. I honestly didn't know what to do. I didn't want her to know I was home yet. After maybe a minute, I heard her walk halfway up the stairs and then stop. I could see her shadow under my door. She just stood there, not moving, as if she knew I was at the door. It felt like at least a full minute. With my mind racing, I decided it was now or never to confront her. I flung the door open, and I was not expecting her to actually already be standing mere feet away from the door, already looking at it, and now looking at me. But I quickly realized, now that I had a closer look, it wasn't the same lady. It was another Hispanic woman. Yes, but her build, hair, and face were all different. There was something so bone-chilling about her face. She had this blank, nearly angry, hateful look. I didn't say anything, neither did she. We just stood there for a few seconds before she slowly turned and walked back down the stairs like nothing had happened. I heard my front door open and close a few seconds later. My heart was pounding and I was shaking. I think I was genuinely too nervous and shaken to move or say a word. I waited maybe 5 minutes before even moving. Dialing 911 was almost difficult with how shaky my fingers were. The police came, and I explained everything. I explained there were 2 different women. I gave them the phone number and email of the cleaning lady and any other info I could provide. The original cleaning lady stopped responding completely after that day. I replaced every lock in the house that same day. Like literally, right after the cops left. I went straight to Ace Hardware. What still bothers me is the officer asking me if I had given anyone else a key. I told him no. He just said, "Sometimes people like that don't work alone." I never hired another cleaner again.